Welcome to the Hunting Beast Report, a live video podcast with Dan Infalt and host Jeremy Gillespie.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Stealth Outdoors. The off-season's a great time to rehab your gear, so head on over to Stealth Outdoors at www.stealthoutdoors.com to pick up some climbing stick wraps, cam buckle covers, platform cable wraps, or stealth strip rolls for all of your miscellaneous silencing needs. Today's show is also made possible by Hunting Beast Gear, innovators in mobile hunting gear and the designers of the Beast Sticks and Beast Stand. Check out the latest products at www.huntingbeastgear.com. And now, on to the podcast. All right, we're live. Today we're joined by special guest Andy Chikowski, and as always, Dan Infalt. Dan, how you doing today?
Good.
And Andy, a lot of people aren't going to be familiar with you, so why don't you give us a brief introduction, who you are, what you did over the weekend, or maybe it was last weekend, and what you do for a living.
Absolutely. So yeah, my name is Andy Chikowski. I live in the Driftless area, Wisconsin, and I kind of dedicated my career to the natural resource industry and help landowners enhance their properties and specialize in habitat enhancements on their properties, and just want to promote better habitat for wildlife and clean air, clean water, all the good things that come with it. So I was fortunate to spend Sunday with Dan on his workshop on the bedding seminar, and it was really great to hear all about the really understand deer behavior as far as bedding. I spend a lot of hours in the woods enhancing early successional forest, and to be able to combine that into bedding structure and really understand the behavior of deer and how the does bed and how a buck beds and how a mature buck beds was very interesting, and I'll be able to continue to get better at what I do also because of understanding kind of Dan's philosophy on deer bedding.
And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to recap the Hill Country workshop, and then we're going to pick Andy's brain on land management, not specifically for private lands, although we will discuss that as well. But we're going to talk about some of the things that Andy's learned over the years that could help us as public land hunters also. So Dan, for those people, I know every year there's requests for Hill Country workshop. So why don't you give us an overview of the workshop, and it sounds like Andy was providing some good information too.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by the amount of people that were requesting a Hill Country workshop. The numbers were pretty low, but that was good for the attendees because low numbers, you get better conversation and such. But it was a fun time. We went to Eric Hoosbo's place at Trophy Adventures and looked at his farm and his new farm he just bought. And it was kind of cool. It's hard to find a good property that has all the features you want to show everybody. But Eric's comes close. It has some pretty good stuff, and it's not what I would say like too great of a property. I mean, I've been on stuff in Iowa where they have like highly managed farms in a row, and you'll have 50 trophy bucks in there, and it's unrealistic because everything is just rubbed to hell and stuff. It's almost like a ranch, His place was a really good place to look because right now he doesn't have a lot of big bucks. He's trying to build, and he's trying to work on the property himself. He's doing enhancements and taking advice from guys like Andy and trying to improve on his property. So it was kind of fun to walk around through there, look at the bedding hills and see some that are that have issues like they're too open, and some he was working on, and look at the actual bedding. And I think one of the big interesting things for everybody was that the very best bedding we found, when you looked at Onyx, you couldn't see the points. After we went in and there were pretty good looking points, bedding points when we were on foot. But we went on Onyx, it just looks like a leeward ridge. And a lot of people would walk right past that. And I think even on public land, that's the kind of stuff you'd want to find. But you could see it on the LiDAR if you use Spartan Forge. which was kind of cool for everybody to see. What were your biggest takeaways, Andy?
I would say the two biggest takeaways were the deer behavior, about how the does typically bed up on them points or them benches, and they kind of bed as a community, looking several different directions. And that kind of that selfish mature buck, he's going to go down below with the thermals coming over his back, looking over that lower bench. So he's totally controlling anything behind him. He's using the does as a kind of using them, and then using his thermals. And like you said, they may move throughout the day a few feet just to catch the thermals perfectly, and then be able to see any danger down below. That really hit home with me. And then number two was how you explained rubs, and how the structure of that mature deer is going to be higher on that tree. How you could explain a 1.5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and then once they hit that mature level 4, 5, 6, that's going to be higher up from the center of that rub. So them were two major takeaways on that. So,
and while we're talking about land, Andy, if someone was looking at buying a new property, what do you think are some really important features or things that are overlooked? And I'll give you an example. I have a friend that bought a property, and it's in Michigan. The main access is on the west side of the property, and the wind is predominantly out of the west and the north. So that was one thing I don't think he thought about when buying the property. That's become quite the challenge, because a lot of times you're accessing from upwind to the deer.
Sure. As far as on a habitat standpoint, that's what comes to my eye right away. It would be, what's the composition, meaning what's the percent of agriculture, what's the percent of woodland habitat, what's the percent of marsh habitat or wetland habitat, and diversity is great. And then just as far as native species, what are, as far as your woodlands, do you have mature white oaks? Do you have early successional habitat? Is the agricultural land being taken care of, or has it been hit, farmed hard? And obviously there's ways to improve on that once you acquire it. Don't let that scare you. But the diversity of plant life, is there meadow areas, so I guess I can't stress species diversity as far as, natural fauna and flora. The more diverse habitat, the more carrying capacity, whether it's deer or grassland birds, things like that. So, the diversity of habitat. So.
And then what about things, give me like 3 or 4 of your top bang for your buck improvements. Like say a guy buys a new property and it's got potential, but it's undeveloped, and they want to maximize. What are the first 3 or 4 things, 2 or 3 things they should be doing?
Well, I can tell you the 3 biggest low-hanging fruits that I've seen on, let's just say, guys that strictly number one goal is, how can I, grow better deer, bigger deer. The 3 major things that I see is their woodlands are mature. There's not that early successional habitat, meaning that young resetting aspen stands, early successional habitat is lacking. And that's one thing that is a quick, not quick, but within a year or 2, you've got that early browse, once the harvest is done, and then done properly. Number 2 would be, a lot of these farms have a 30 to 40% composition of egg land, meaning if they, if it's a 100-acre property, there's usually 30 to 40 acres of productive farmland. And with that being said, I think there's a low-hanging fruit on utilizing and working with your production renter on, let's use some cover crops. When we talk about food value on the landscape, if there's nothing green on that landscape for 6 or 7 months out of the season, you're talking just a few pounds per acre. When you start using cover crops, you have 30, 40 acres, you're talking tons per acre on food value. And these deer, like right now is a perfect example. The farms that have winter rye, that's 10 to 14 days of the quickest, greenest stuff right now, and that's where you see your herds of deer right now, because they know what their bodies need, and that gives you. And if you're thinking big picture and trying to grow inches on whitetails, why wouldn't you give them the best? Right now is a critical time. Give them an extra 2 weeks of critical forage. And my third thing would be the lack of forbs, meaning that prairie habitat, wildflowers, that forest edge, creating more edge along your woodland, whether that's putting a prairie strip in, and basically your from your production field, you're transitioning. They call it feathering the edge, softening the edge from your production egg field. You're transitioning that into more of a prairie habitat, which is excellent deer food if you get the right species, and transitioning that edge to an early successional woodland edge, and transitioning that edge to a mature woodland edge. So softening the edge. So them would be the three biggest components, low-hanging fruit on properties that you could start to separate and do in like I said, tons per acre of natural browse versus pounds per acre of natural browse. So,
One of the things that I've been noticing from a lot of guys I talk to, like in these workshops or even online, when I'm taking questions, it just seems to me that most hunters just look at food, as corn, beans, turnips, wintergreens, and the only natural forage they seem to look at is like acorns. We came up with that in a workshop too. We had people saying, well, how are they going to the fields? And it's like, well, they're not always. A lot of times if you can thicken up that area, that becomes a food source, but that's not apples to apples. So talk a little bit about how much deer eat browse and what you think are the preferred browse. I know we were talking offline about aspen being deer candy, and give us your thoughts on that.
Real quick,
yep. So there's
Andy,
yep.
sorry, I want to add on to that. Maybe if you could do that by portion of the season, because obviously the early season browse is going to be different than the late season. So maybe if you could specify like 2 or 3 phases of the season, what you think are preferred then.
Yep. So you might have to ask the question again, but as far as there's primary browses and there's secondaries, there's preferences on browse. So as Dan said, that early successional aspen, that's kind of like deer candy. Your red osier dogwoods, like American elm, like if you're, a lot of that times doesn't reach timber values. So if you got a 3 to 4 inch American elm competing for sunlight, a lot of times you're better off just resetting that, let that they call them mineral sprouts. So when that stump sprouts, these mineral sprouts, them deer, get a lot of mineral, and it's just very nutritious to them. So American elm is a primary, red maple is a primary, and a lot of times you cut red maple and within days it's sprouting up. Even in the summer, you'll get a foot of growth if it's in the middle of summer. It's just, a lot of these species, if they're reset, meaning cut from the stump, they'll immediately start to grow in 3, 4, 5 feet a year. So if the deer have access to that, they're going to keep that nip down pretty good. And if there's not acres of it, they'll kind of be able to keep that at a fairly healthy stage, or a stage of browse for them for 3 to 5 years. And then Dan, we talked about that. I'm kind of changing subjects here, but we talked about, I've been in this bluff country for 15 years now, and I've never seen a winter. And obviously it was a less an easy winter, let's call it, as far as snow depth and temperatures, but I've never seen so many standing beans and so much standing corn that has not been touched. These food plots that these guys, 3 to 5 acre cracks that they put in for shed hunting and things like that, and for deer health for the winter. Deer were literally walking around these plots. I spent the whole winter in 2 properties that had countless acres, and the deer were actually walking around standing beans. And the reason why is they had access to a bumper crop of red oak acorns this year by us, and it just hit home that the natural preference for acorns and what that does,
Mhm.
they surely prefer that when they're walking by standing beans. I've never seen it before. Usually beans, they're wiped out in December if you have any excess.
I was
But
shocked. I mean, when I got there, I was shocked, and I said, "How come there's no deer? Do you have any deer on your property?" And he's like, "Yeah, tons of deer. It's it was the acorns. It was Eric's thought on it, and then you back that up." What was shocking to me is like I got a couple of little food plots in my backyard just for fun. I don't even hunt in them, but it attracts a lot of does and small deer, but not even that many. I mean, I might have 2 or 3 visitors a night. I have a camera in there that sees them, and my food plots look devastated next to his fields. It was unbelievable, the standing corn and stuff. And I remember last time we were up there, I mean, there were sheds all over the fields. There's nothing up there. They're all in the
they were,
woods.
yep, they're spread out. I mean, they didn't have to concentrate themselves this year on them food sources. They stayed spread out. And it's the first time I seen it, where, like I said, they wouldn't eat beans. And then back to like natural foods, you know, they have a high preference for forbs. When I say forbs, some of these wildflowers, in these prairie systems, there's several species of asters that they're putting these monarch mixes together, but they're really highlighting deer food. So these deer hunters, that we're really in need of this pollinators, mix, and they're really starting to put species that tailor deer food too. So it's like a win-win.
Hmm.
But deer naturally prefer that natural food sources. Obviously it's hard to beat alfalfa and soybeans at that summertime, but their diet's going to consist of natural browse, natural forbs, and that's what that they know, that's what they want, and they're going to eat a high percentage of that. So if I was a public land hunter, I'd be paying attention. A lot of these public lands are managed with controlled burns, things like that, but from the state and the feds. Where are the controlled fires during this time of the year? Because fire promotes better forb habitat, better pollinator habitat. Well, pollinators just don't use that. The deer are going to highlight some of them pollinators too. So early season, you may separate yourself by paying attention. Where are the cover crops on the surrounding fields? Because they're going to hit some of them variety of cover crops.
Mhm.
After the beans are off, or if it was a winter wheat field that was harvested in July, and that guy decides to put in some type of cover crop system, I would pay attention to some of those food sources too, between controlled burning and where was some of the local or recent timber harvest on that public land, and what stage of browse is it at, or what height, things like that. So
And probably look for certain species too. Like
absolutely,
the poplar would be a something I'd go right to if it was
yes.
fresh cut in the last what do you say, 3 to 5 years is what you think?
Yep, even in 5 years, popple's almost past that browse stage. It grows so fast, so it all depends how big and how they're hitting it. But the first couple years for popple, but some of them other species, elm and stuff, you might get 3-4 years, of browse, but it all depends on deer density and how they're keeping that browse down. I just viewed one of my sites from last year that I cut about 18 acres of between hinge cutting and stump cutting, and I was absolutely amazed. I'm like, why did these not stump sprout? And
Mhm.
then I would look over where there was tops and where I'd hinged it into like bundles, and here was 3 to 4 feet of fresh growth from one year, which you would expect. Well, all these other areas where there was access to deer, they kept it like 3 to 4 inches. They completely kept that down, and I couldn't believe how aggressive they were on half of that site. But the other half, that where there was bundles where they couldn't access, was 3 to 4 feet. So that just tells you, and that was like 17 acres. It was impressive how they kept up. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So
A lot of people don't realize that a lot of that stuff, like new aspen growth, can attract more deer than the food plots or crop fields. And even if you have deer going to crop fields, some of those little cuts, it doesn't even have to be very big, can be a spot that they go to in daylight before they go to the crops.
Yeah, because it's probably next to some cover or a little more cover, that transition, you're creating the edge. When you do a fresh cut, you're creating an edge. Deer is an edge species, as you know, and it makes sense.
Yeah, real quick. One of the things in Michigan that I used to like to do is Michigan, they have forestry reports and you can look them up by management unit. So something that I was doing maybe 10 years ago is the foresters a lot of times would actually comment on the deer browse in the area. So not only could you see like a more granular view of the forest, this is pre a lot of the satellite mapping stuff, or that's as good as it is now, but they would have like the outlines of each stand and it would tell you what the predominant is. So if you're looking for white oaks or red oaks, you could find that. And then there would be comments from the forester and on each stand about if they'd cut it, when they'd cut it, and what the regrowth was like, and what the deer browse pressure was like. So that's a good resource if anyone's trying to hunt more big woods type public lands.
Absolutely.
So one thing I would like to say is that if somebody was going to do land management, and I seen this because I used to go visit a lot of properties to give people advice, and I've tend to have gone a little different direction now. But what I saw was a lot of people would listen to a podcast or read a book and run out and do a lot of changes. And for the most part, the changes were usually good. I mean, they were helping, because anytime you cut something, you make it better. But what I would often tell these guys is they should have called me first, or somebody in first, because I can't put a tree back, and I can't, it's very difficult to move a water hole over 100 yards, or do you see a lot of that?
I would say the biggest mistake, and they're only trying to do good, but the biggest mistake I see is high grading, or when your biggest and best trees are taken, and usually them are your highest producing mass trees or your best canopy trees, like let's say a white oak or a red oak. Some of those need to be left, and a lot of times, and loggers are trying to make a living too, but a lot of times that's where they make the most money. But most of the time it's the 50 or 60% of lower quality stuff that really needs to get removed, and you need to leave the larger, nicer trees that are actually worth where the logs are, if your goal is mass production and having a healthier wood. So the biggest mistake I see, Dan, is the woods, the best stuff is taken and the lesser desirable, because it's not really marketable. So I think you'll start to see a change in that as people understand that they might have to pay someone to get it right, and leave the best material, and you're not going to get paid for your woods anymore, because everything's, a lot of stuff, most of the majority of the acres have been picked over, and you only can do that so long before you got nothing, so that's the biggest mistake I see. And then another big mistake is not controlling buckthorn or some of these invasives before you do any canopy manipulation, because you want to regenerate deer browse in species that deer want to eat or other animals want to use. And some of these invasives, you remove the canopy and they just take over. And I don't like to see that. So if a guy did the measures beforehand, it just puts you in a better spot to regenerate stuff you want. So
how do you
it's
go?
amazing that buckthorn. I have a ton of it, especially in the public land where I hunt. And even when we were hunting the conservancy, I think Rick mentioned that to you, that he's constantly removing buckthorn in the conservancy. It's amazing how much deer love that stuff. They eat those leaves like crazy, but
sure,
in the long run, that's just a horrible plant, because I could see that stuff just taking over the whole forest and choking out all the new growth. It just, because it grows even under the canopy.
Yeah, it almost creates a jungle-like environment, and I think it almost gets too thick where stuff don't even want to get through it once it overtakes. And a lot of the worst spots I see it is where the canopy, about 50% of the canopy has been removed, a select cut or a high grade cut, whatever you want to call it. Once you remove that canopy, and then oak and aspen need full sunlight, the ones you're trying to regenerate, and you're not quite getting enough sunlight there, but you're getting enough sunlight for the buggers and that's part of the problem too, is your good stuff needs sunlight to the floor. And as you said, buckthorn, you give it a little and it'll take all of it.
Yeah.
So
What are the best
So if you
measures
were
to
going to
mitigate that?
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. What are the best measures to mitigate like invasive species before you cut? What are you doing on a property typically?
So the most efficient technique that I've found that I do, if it's at a controllable level, if it's at not what I call the jungle stage, if it's at a controllable level, we basal bark spray it, meaning I put about 2.5 gallons of product in a backpack. I mix bark oil blue with a triclopyr mix, and then if there's other invasives, depending on, I will add a 3-way mix if needed. If it's strictly buckthorn, I use a triclopyr mixed with a bark oil blue, and you basically do not have to cut that plant. You hit the base of the plant, and it's called basal bark spraying. So you can look that up if you have interest, and it saves a whole step, and you can be what I call most efficient. And my job is to get buckthorn under control and also be efficient with these landowners. So I haven't found a better measure. If it is a jungle and there's equipment access, then I utilize, I have a couple really good contractors that have forestry mulchers or forestry mowers, and we usually open up, if it's that bad, we open it up with a forestry mower first and then start our basal barking and our game plan after that. So.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
So
I
if you're going
interrupted you there.
drive around and look for public land, what kind of terrain would you be looking for, or plant life, if you're choosing from different properties? Like, at what stage?
I would be looking for, like I said, that diversity of, is there some managed grasslands? Is there some early successional forests there? Is there some mature islands of oak? That's what I'd be looking for. Is there some heavy bedding area, where people are not getting into? That's what I'd be looking for. A diverse array of habitats, and how are they managed? Is it a prairie that hasn't been burnt for 10 years and there's no forbs out there, or is it a prairie that's managed properly and you have a bunch of wildflowers and food sources right, near that cover? So that'd be some of the stuff I'd be looking for.
I would have had dings on every one of those. I would have said the same thing, except for I never keyed in on the wildflower aspect that you're talking about. That has a lot of interest to me because I've never heard that before.
And that's just starting to get popular with, as we're building, like a couple of these. There's 3 properties I'm helping with right now, and I'm so happy that they're doing it. They're looking at it as a big picture, and we're putting in prairie strips along a lot of their field edge, up to, I don't know, 13 acres on one, 17 acres on another, and we're still undecided on the third one, but significant acres. But you think about the edge effect that you have when you're putting these 150 foot strips of prairie along your woodland edge. The farmer's still keeping the most productive ground. You're adding a whole array of edge for not just deer, but an array of songbirds and the pollinators, and they all work together, and they're targeting species. When the Pheasants Forever staff and some of these NRCS staff, they're building mixes, to help reach the goals of how can we have some, specific species that are beneficial, not for pollinators also, but for deer. And that helps everything. So I'm all about that. So
When you talked about feathering the edge, and I was going to ask that earlier, but you brought it up now. What are some good places to get those forb mixes that are, not just a straight food plot mix, that might help you go from your, what you called production ag, to your early successional? And another, sorry, I'm going to put 2 questions here. So where and what type of mix, and then early successional, just for clarity, that's like after something's been cut the first 1 to 4 or 5 years. Is that accurate?
Yep. So early successional woodlands, or edge, softening the edge, that would be your. It looks like brush, but it's all these stump sprouts or aspen. They spread as a clone, so they're shooting up rhizomes, hundreds of them from that main stump that you took. So early succession. When I say early succession, that would be more of your younger browse. And that may be elm, that may be red maple, that may be aspen, that may be young oak, but it's at a young stage, during that browse stage. So.
And then what about the mixes? Where can you get them, and what would you recommend for that feathered edge? Between the early successional and the production ag, what kind of mix would
Yep.
you put in there?
As far as Wisconsin, I would really take advantage of there's field biologists throughout the state. They each have X amount of counties, and it's through Pheasants Forever. That's directly connected to the federal government, but there's great resources out there from Pheasants Forever. And also there's another really good one, and there's staff throughout the state, in each territory. It'd be the Partners for Fish and Wildlife. So that's under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife. That's directly for private landowners, and their staff are really, really great to work with, along with Pheasants Forever. And they really do a great job on specializing the mixes and helping you with potential funding out there. And these programs, I mean, there's a lot out there, but for the general landowner, it can get very confusing, trust me, but there are resources out there. And I would start with, if you're looking for these prairie mixes, with Pheasants Forever, field biologist, their farm bill biologist, or the Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife. So.
Well, Andy, I want to do a thought exercise. So let's say I'm a new landowner. I just bought a section. I'm apparently a millionaire too. But this is a dream scenario, right? So I got a new section, and based on what you picked up, and what you obviously already have a ton of knowledge, but what you picked up at Dan's workshop, I've got some hill country, bluff country type habitat, that's mature forest and an open canvas. What are you going to look at, and how are you going to game plan, like how to optimize that property?
Yeah, I mean, where are the aspen stands? Is there mature aspen that we could patch, clear cut, patch, regeneration cut, whatever you want to call it? That is quick deer cover. And then, Dan, we had several discussions of these bowl areas below these bedding points, and we talked about how can we actually get 3 to 5 acre. You got these 3 to 5 acre bowls that are kind of sitting, what I call stagnant. They're at a mature stage that really don't have any timber value. They really don't have an oak component. And I just recently completed one, and I call them little bedrooms. And I'm not going to call them that anymore, because I learned a lot where your mature buck's gonna bed, but it once again produces that early successional tons per acre of natural deer food, and gives you that cover. And Dan, you've commented several times, you're going to still get some does and stuff to utilize that, but then again, you're creating that cover aspect when when opening weekend of deer season, if you're trying to hold deer, and if you want a great staging area or great browse area for herd health. So, and Dan, you can comment on that. We talked 2 or 3 different times on these bowl areas.
Yeah, I think like you're stating, I mean the more cover you have, the better. The more young growth you have, the better. But I do think in some scenarios, like I can remember one at Eric's, where if that's one of his favorite hunting spots on the top of that bowl or draw with 2 points coming out that are bedding points, and he can get to the top there and drop his thermals on there, maybe on that one he don't thicken that, and instead he thickens the tops above the bedding. In other areas he does thicken, but that one he doesn't want to put does on or blowing when his thermals drop down there. I could see that, but for the most part, most of them, I think I would add cover for sure. Now, on some of these properties, you think you would be careful not to thicken too much, so that you have stuff to work with in the future. I mean, so you're not, like, you don't run to a point where everything's kind of mid-growth. You know what I mean?
Yep. And I think if it's like these plateau areas that you want to thicken up, I think once with these forestry mulchers or forestry mowers, if there's good access, you could potentially keep that. If you run a forestry mower one time, you can, what I say, stay in control, leave your biggest oaks more of a savanna setting, but you could always reset that every 3 years with a brush hog. Most of these
Mhm.
guys have a brush hog, and if it's not steep, you could stay in control of that. Or fire is another tool that you can keep this early successional stuff. But yeah, I think you want to do it in increments, and I think you want to leave mature corridors. I mean, the, I work hand
It's
in
hard to
hand with
kill a
these.
deer if it's keeping thick everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I work hand in hand with these landowners, and I want to make darn sure before I cut anywhere that if there's a core hunting spot or core funnel areas, I don't want to change. I don't want to change some of them corridor areas. So I wouldn't just go run out and start cutting the 5 acres here. I would have a game plan on strategically where you put it, and have your 5 year plan on, we're going to do 10 acres this year, and in each year you have a spot, and kind of a rotating that around.
So on Eric's property, Eric was looking at, and I kind of agree with him, thickening above the bedding, up to the bedding, and so the bucks had cover behind them, which they kind of prefer. What I noticed is he opened it up pretty wide and had to get the sun in there.
Hmm.
And I was a little concerned about that in some of the spots, that it would take a while for there to get to be cover. You said that aspen can grow like 6 feet in 1 year, though, right?
Yes,
So
but
is there some scenarios where you're not going to get that growth that fast, where you can get more briars and stuff like that? Is there stuff you got to look for?
I think if you don't get enough sunlight and you're cutting aspen, it's not going to regenerate. So if it's red maple, I think you don't have to, that's shade intolerant. So shade tolerant, I'm sorry,
Mm,
that's going to stump sprout. So it depends what species. And,
okay. Which
and
makes
if
sense because all the aspen that we saw was on the edge of the forest,
correct.
not into it.
Yeah. So where we ended, where the best bedding, that you determined, and when we seen that last area, it was like, whoa, this is definitely a buck bedding area. That was actually on the north side, if I remember right, and that was red maple. So I was like, holy cow, yeah. So that was like the cooler side. So I was trying to link temperature and thinking different scenarios. Why is it this one? But I think it came back to that was an area that really got no pressure at all, or nobody went back
It's
there.
pretty much the place where nobody went.
So it depends. And even though that stuff's going to grow fast, it's still going to take longer. Like if it's a temperature thing, Dan, on your bedding positions, it's going to take longer to cool that down, if you know what I mean. And on a hot day, even though it's 8-year-old stuff, let's say, and it's 20 feet tall or 15 feet tall, it's still going to probably be warmer in there than a mature forest. So
Mm.
I think it's a fine balance, but you thicken it up. It's, you get it. Sunlight is key to getting that browse back, or that young stump sprouts. It's going to grow fast. I mean, it's going to grow fast, but it's going to change, it's going to change let's say that core bedding. So I think you do it, I don't know what the right word is, but you don't have to be over aggressive. You work into it, and if it's red maple, I think you can be very non-aggressive. Take 30-40% of the canopy first time, see how it reacts, and then do it in increments. If it's aspen, and that you're going to change the component, aspen needs a patch regeneration cut. It needs a patch clear cut to get it reset. You need sunlight. So
One of the great things about your job has got to be, like, I look at that bedding area and I'm thinking, this is the best bedding area on the property. I don't know if I want to go in there and cut everything right away. And but in your job, you do enough cutting that you see reactions, and you can kind of see how the deer work in those
yeah.
areas.
Yeah, but with what I know now, being with you for that day, I will be a little bit more conscious to, usually them benches and them, what I call them points or spines. Usually I like to you leave them, not be too aggressive, because that's usually a travel corridor too, and a lot of
Mhm.
times you sit at the top of that and let things funnel out. So I don't like to manipulate them as much, and always have these, especially if they're nice mature oak, take out a little bit of the less desirable stuff, but leave it as a travel. You start when you do a patch clear cut or a regeneration cut, there's a lot of slash, and I pull as much of the stuff out as I can with my skidder to get it still, so it's not barriers. But you know I never like to be too aggressive on them points, because the wildlife, that's kind of a travel corridor. So
Mhm.
now, if you're out towards the field and it's not getting hunted, that's not a core hunting spot or any interest for the landowner, and there's a pocket of aspen right on that edge, you're darn right we're going to reset that aspen at the first 30 or 40 feet of the field edge, because I know it's going to regenerate, and it's going to be you're going to create another edge, and great, a great habitat for not just deer but grouse and everything else. So it's you know aspen is easy. I like aspen because I know I can get it to come back. And a
Mhm.
lot of times you can expand it if you expand your cut area. You usually will get that clone, them rhizomes, shoots to expand, out in the field and on the edges of the woodland that you opened up. So
So now when you cut an area and say you got aspen mixed in there, you got some ash, some other stuff, and you got like box elders in there. Uh, um, Obviously you're gonna spray the buckthorn, but if you had box elders in there and you don't want them to regenerate, are you doing something with that?
I'm basil barking with the same mix. So a lot of we actually did that today. If it's solid box elder, I want something to come back. So, and if we're not getting a forestry mower in there or anything, we're going to let some of the box elder come back. Are we still taking out some? Yes. If it's just a box elder here or there, we're definitely taking that out. I'd rather have you know, an elm or an oak or an aspen versus a box elder. Box elder is a native species, but they call it a invasive native type thing. It is in the maple family actually, but it is some browse, but it grows so fast, and it doesn't seem to be on the top of their list. It seems like it's a lower browse, from what I've seen. I
Well, I
actually
don't
see
see
the
much of anything they don't eat.
gotcha. I see. I've got a bunch of box elder I had cut, and I got to go back out and hit them. They're a couple years old, but I see a porcupine's really been hammering mine. I usually we don't get porcupines around here, but I see he likes that box elder, so have at her. Uh,
So now, box elder can be pretty big and blockish. Um, I thought about like in some scenarios they would make good hinge for like bed cover. So you wouldn't be opposed to like use one or something for the right cover. Um,
No, I think you could be creative. It's when you're doing this timber stand improvement, forest stand improvement, um, deer habitat, wildlife habitat in these woodlands, it's an art. I mean, believe it or not, it's an art. So yes, you can be creative with that if you're thinking through this is a pocket that makes perfect sense to create some of that overhead structure. Um, you got to be a little careful with some of the box elders with the lean. They can barb a chair real bad. But yes, you can be creative with some of that box elder if you want that green plant. One other negative I do see with box elder is a lot of times they kind of shade out these waterway areas where a lot of the water, these valleys that where the water flows. You don't get a lot of
mhm.
forb growth or grass growth under that once they really take hold. So they shade a lot of things out. So I really don't have a problem taking, some of that canopy out, especially if it's box elder, just to get more diversity on the forest floor for erosion and such. These rain events seem like when they come, they come in full force. So the more grass and species diversity you can have underneath, I think the better. And box elder usually does a pretty good job of shading things out.
So if you're gonna hinge things like What do you do mostly? Elm or?
Elm works really good and is safe. Actually, some of the lesser desirable oaks are easy to hinge. But we're not talking 8-inch diameter. We're talking, 3 to 4, 5-inch max diameter. I'm not doing big trees. These smaller trees where you can control, and they make a habitat push pull where you can, get your overhead, your pressure up above, or I just cut a Y stick and use that sometimes. Hickory does hinge pretty well. Elm, red maple
High up.
does. Go ahead. Yeah.
How high up?
Like chest high, but obviously, you're putting yourself in danger with your chainsaw when you do some of that. Um, but I just take my time and chest high, and then some of the red maple is excellent deer food if you can get it to hinge. A lot of times it rips off of the stump, but like I said, I'm not doing big stuff. I'm doing that 4-inch, 4-inch, a little bit bigger than a beer can, or I should say pop can. I'm not targeting big stuff. 8 inches or less for sure. I don't promote anything bigger than that.
All right. Well, Dan, we got a whole bunch of questions here, so I don't know if you had anything else you want to ask Andy, or if you want to jump into the Q&A.
No, we should jump into the Q&A. Just keep them directed towards the subject matter.
Sure. I'm going to break the rule right away because there's one and you might want to answer this. Joe Addis says, Dan, is there a promo code for you like last year at the Sportsman's Show in Wisconsin Dells?
I did not work a deal with them this year. They didn't want to pay me what I wanted, so there's no deal. I'll be there. They can come visit me, but I'm not. I didn't do anything with them this year. Sorry.
Okay. Steve Denoyer says, Andy, what do you think about planting preferred browse trees and bushes as a food plot, so to speak? I clear cut 18 acres of red pine, thinking of putting it back into early successional as food. So as opposed to a conventional food plot, I guess. What would your approach be if you clear cut 18 acres of red pine?
I guess, is there a way to keep the deer out to get the stuff going? I think it's a good idea. You're not gonna regenerate anything if nothing's, if there's no stumps there. So I think, I don't even know if they sell aspen as a transplant, but that's something to look into. Aspen tends to take off, red maple, elm, things like that. Shrubs, some of the shrubs, red osier dogwood can handle a lot of deer browse once it's established. There's shrubs out there that would be great browse. Some of the orchard species, some of the apple that have higher acidity, once they start producing apples, tend to that keep that soft mast, harder longer as far as your apple. So with the acidity.
Do you do any sort of preventative measures? So if you've got a smaller area that you're working on to keep the deer out, do you do fencing or the wires? What's an effective way to prevent that?
What I do on some of my food plots, because it's a heavily wooded area with high deer density and we don't have a lot of ag around, I actually put a temporary solar fence. It's a 3-way strip. You can look it up. Solar fencing herbivores. I think you just look it under. There's YouTube videos, but there's one strand of poly wire, and then 4 feet on the inner side there's 2 strands, and it forms optical illusion, and it works really well as long as you have your electricity working. You basically train your deer. They come up to that first one and they get zapped, and they don't know how to clear that. And it's worked really good for like our bean plots and stuff, our mixes, to keep the deer off for a month or two to get ahead of the browse. So temporary fencing with poly wire. Gallagher makes a really good poly wire, along with reels to roll it up, because a lot of times, half mile will get you, you got to roll up a half mile to get a quarter acre or half acre because you're running 3 times around. That works well. And I've actually on 3 to 5 acre plantings, we've put up permanent fence for 4 to 8 years to get these shrubs and stuff rolling. Otherwise, we could never get them to take without keeping the deer out. I hate I hate putting fences up because it's just not natural. But these temporary ones for like food plots work really good for us. I put them up a week after I plant, and I take them down strategically. But even if I had them up for a month and a half, would be adequate to get your crop past that browse stage or past the forage stage. So.
Yeah, just to fall off of that, if you're not going to fence there, what size? Just assume average deer density, because I know it's going to vary wildly. But assume an average deer density. How big of an area do you need where that area can withstand natural browse pressure without any mitigation, like a fence or anything?
10 acres is great. 10 acres is a bigger area. I seen I couldn't believe it, 17 acres, and they were targeting anything they had access to. The more, the better. I don't want to put acres on. Just the more, the more scattered, the more acres, the better. So more, edge spreads it out at least. And some of these species can handle that, but I'll be curious. Literally these red maple, they had them down to less than a thumb. They had chewed, pencil, about a diameter pencil right down to 3 inches. I'm like, holy man. So I imagine that they will come back this year, but I don't know how many times they can do that before they will actually kill them. But we'll find out.
Well, this would be a question for both of you. In hill country, are mature bucks likely to bed on a point that has a bluff on one or more sides?
What do you mean by bluff? Straight drop off?
That's what it sounds like. Yeah.
Well, they got to have an escape route. So they need to have an escape route. So they could have it on one end as long as they got a way out of there. Which too, I mean, talking about altering land, you can make an escape route too. They're not going to want to run through open stuff. They don't want to run off of a bedding point into grass wide open. They don't want to run into a lake. They're not going to jump off a cliff, but they can go down some pretty steep stuff. I mean, sometimes you might think it's so steep that there's no way a deer can go down it, but they'll maze you. They're like goats. So it can be pretty steep. I mean, it can't be a sheer drop, but they do have to have an escape.
And Andy, I'd be curious if after attending the workshop, looking back in some of the properties that you've worked on, did you have any aha moments when you were with Dan, looking back at some of those areas that you've been on in the past?
Just to take home on some of that, it's just going to make me a better habitat manager, just understanding that behavior. And Dan hit home over and over. I mean, we went from point to point to point, and it just made perfect sense. I mean, and the sign was there. I mean, it was evident, and I don't know, he hit home on them benches and how them thermals work, and it's a game changer, And then as far as aha moments, it's I'll definitely change some of the strategy of what's getting cut and what's not getting cut on them core, let's call them mature buck points. So.
Somebody had a question about mulberry. What do you know about mulberry? Good, bad,
Mulberry.
Neutral?
I know the raccoons really like it. I don't know if it's native. I've heard, that it is a food source. But I know I guess I don't promote it because I don't think it is a native species to our area. But I think the birds like it. I know the raccoons like it.
The deer do eat it. I got a bunch of it in my yard, and they come in and they eat the buds off of it when it's green. Just about everything utilizes. I didn't know it wasn't natural.
Dan, did Carol plant that for raccoon bait?
No.
Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
There may be a native species of mulberry, but the ones I'm familiar with are I guess non-native. So
Okay.
Dan, we got a question about saddles, so it's directed towards you, but I got a question that I'm going to add for Andy. So, Dan, could you describe what you mean when you use the term saddle in hill country, and do bucks bet on these or travel these saddles? And then, so answer that, and then Andy, the question I have for you is, if you have a good saddle on the property, are you doing anything from a habitat perspective to optimize travel through that area? So, either one of you, I guess. Go ahead first, Dan.
So a saddle is just a low point or a dip along a ridge, and a lot of times that's where deer cross in the low point. That's what's referred to as a saddle. It's not really a bedding spot. No.
I'm just making sure it's I'm not crunching it or putting a bunch of tops in there to promote or not to prohibit travel. I'm keeping it as a travel corridor. If there's some lesser desirable stuff around there, I will take that out, but I'm making sure that saddle area is still more of a travel corridor.
Yeah, because a lot of times that's the hunting position. In public land, a lot of times people started looking for those so much that saddles started getting overhunted and they're not as good. But still on private land, that's generally where your clients are probably hunting.
Yeah, especially in hill country. I'd be curious to know if you had a property that would allow it, if you could optimize, let's say, 400 yards away on either side of the saddle for doe bedding or something where you could entice a buck to use that. Because Dan, we talked about this on the forum quite a bit. Guys, when they look for saddles, it's got to lead to somewhere. You see people that are like, oh, here's a saddle, but it's coming from nowhere and it's going to a main paved road or something. It's like, well, that's not the one you're looking for.
The farther you get away from bedding, the more likely you're not seeing mature bucks or less mature bucks going through that saddle. So I'm always looking for the bedding and then looking for features around it where they're coming out. I mean, that's a big thing that we did at the workshop. I always start at the bedding and go out from there because a lot of those bucks don't get very far in daylight. No, they all get, long distance occasionally or nobody'd kill deer, right? But if you get it within that certain range of that bedding, then you're always within that movement. It's just a matter of if he's home. So for me, it's really about to maximize my time in the field is about getting as close as I can to bedding and then looking for those features coming out of the bedding.
And Andy, we're going to test your knowledge here. Got a question from Chris Moe says, and I'm not sure at all, so we'll see if anything pops up in your brain. What is a small spindly tree bush? It's brownish, grows very curvy in patches. Japanese maple, perhaps? Could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
Give me your top three guesses.
I would say bush honeysuckle if I had to guess. Bush honeysuckle, especially if it's got if it's hollow within the stem.
I think that was most of the questions looking through here. I thought we had a few more, but there was just a lot of chat today. So, Dan, anything you want to add before we wrap up? We're right at an hour now.
I would like to have Andy tell us where people can get a hold of him if they're looking for him. You got a website or something, Andy?
I do, yeah. Driftlesslandmanagement.com. I've got my wife posts some stuff of some of my projects on Facebook. Feel free to give me a call. I'd be happy to talk with you and hopefully be able to help you. If that's just an on-site visit, I'd be happy to try to. I've got a lot of lessons learned, put it that way. I spend a lot of time on different properties, so I just like making things better and the future of hunting and the future of good habitat and clean water, clean air is I guess that's what I do.
And as a prospective client, not myself, but if I was one, where are you, like what county are you located and how far are you willing to, or do you typically travel?
I cover a lot of the driftless, Jackson, Trempealeau, Buffalo, Monroe, La Crosse, Clark County. I kind of stay in that area, but and then where I grew up in Berlin, I help some of them landowners over there. If people need help, we'll make it happen. So.
All right. Well, hey, tons of excellent knowledge, and it's interesting to hear from that perspective of land management. So I know I definitely took a few things away. I want to thank you for your time, Andy. And Dan, I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, Andy. The reason we had you on is because you really made an impression on me. You're really knowledgeable about the plants and the landscape, and just really like your overall attitude about maintaining a great ecosystem and not just so worried about deer or whatever. It's about everything all together. So I really appreciate everything you're doing and how you're helping people, and keep up the great work.
Appreciate it, Dan. Thanks for inviting me. Sure appreciate it.
All right. We'll catch everybody next week, Tuesday, 7 Central. Bye, everybody.